Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and I can't believe I've not touched on this topic yet, but better late than never, I suppose. So today we're going to be showcasing the Matrix GT1000FX power amp. This is the 1U version. There's also a 2U. This is a well-respected solid-state power amp that was really designed to pair with fractal amp modelers. We will of course be doing just that with the AX8 today, and I will provide a patch in the description below, one of three actually, that will allow you to connect the effects loop output of the AX8 to the inputs of a stereo power amp, control a speaker cabinet, and still have the main outputs provide a cabinet impulse response sound for either front of house use or for recording, whatever you want to do with it. Today's focus though is going to be with a real guitar amp head in conjunction with the AX8 in a configuration that is called wet, dry, wet, even though in this scenario you're really just going to hear wet, wet. Wet, dry, wet was a fairly popular setup when rack-mounted multi-effects units reigned supreme, and it's still used by some very iconic guitarists even today. And the basic setup is in the middle you would have your dry sound, and that would be a guitar cabinet with an amp head. And if you have an amp head such as a Mesa Boogie Mark IV or a rectifier or even a Randall Thrasher, they have this lovely feature called a raw or slave output, and this is tapped off of the power amp, meaning that you're getting the entire sound of the guitar amp, not just the preamp if you were to do this in the effects loop. And it's still at a reasonable volume level, power level that any line level gear can handle. So you would hook that to your guitar cab. You can still use stuff in front of it like an overdrive, wah pedal, compressor, all that good stuff. And then you would tap the raw output of that amplifier and put it through the aforementioned multi-effects unit. Now, one of the bigger draws of these effects units is that unlike a lot of guitar pedals at the time, and even today, they are in stereo. So you can turn your mono guitar amp sound into a lovely wet reverb chorus delay rich tone. And because we've already retained the power amp sound with the raw output, we can just use a plain solid state power amp and not color the sound anymore with tubes. But if your amplifier is devoid of that feature and you are forced to use the effects send instead of a raw output, then you can use a tube-based power amp such as those offered by VHT or Marshall, even Mesa, and achieve the same thing. At the end of this setup, you're going to have a left wet cabinet in stereo. You're going to have a center mono dry cab with no effects after the amp, and of course a matching right wet cabinet. And we're going to be doing something almost identically today, except instead of using three cabs, we're going to use one stereo cabinet and a load box. And this actually makes it that much more interesting for me. This would actually yield even better results with two mono cabinets because you get more spacing, therefore a larger stereo image. But the load box in particular makes this cool because, one, you're not wasting a cabinet on what I think is kind of a competing sound, and it's cheaper. In this case, a load box, a small rack unit, and a decently sized 2x12 is coming in at about a third the space that a traditional wet, dry, wet setup would have. Of course, you don't get nearly as large of a stereo image here because we don't have the two speakers separated. So if you're going to do something similar for a live setup or jamming, I would highly recommend you have two separate cabinets for just that reason. But for recording purposes, for demos, this does basically the same thing. The cable routing is going to be identical, all that kind of stuff, so it really does translate. The one difference here is we're using the AX8 for all of our effects, both in front of and after the amp, which is part of what makes it so powerful. Of course, if you have an AX8 2 or 3, you can do the exact same thing. And with the 3, you're actually going to be able to do one thing I'm not. So we'll certainly get into that. So the second preset linked in the description is very similar to a preset that I created quite a while ago where we put a real amplifier through the effects loop of the AX8, and instead of running it in 4-cable method where the effects would be in the loop of the amp, we're just going to bypass that, put all the effects afterwards. What this allows you to do is use the amp block as well. So say for rhythm stuff, I want to use the Thrasher here, but for leads and cleans, I don't want to use that amp. I'd like to use what is built in the AX8 itself, and we can do that. And once we bypass the effects loop, we're rocking straight digital. And it's probably my favorite setup in terms of wet, dry, wet with the AX8 because you add another virtual 2 channels to your arsenal. You might remember though, we used that last preset for entirely direct applications though, whether it be for a silent home recording setup or to have just a full-on direct to PA sound. And we can't do that here because we're using all of the outputs of the AX8 effects loops tied up in the amp. The output is going to the power amp, and so we're out. We can't, you know, put a secondary cab IR sound. However, if you have an AX8 you can do that. So just change the routing of this patch a little bit and you'll be able to do exactly that. We can do just that, except in mono, which is no longer wet, dry, wet, it's wet. In my opinion, stereo effects is what makes this setup worth doing. But if you still like to try this out and have a direct sound out with your AX8, you can do that. We're just going to be panning everything left that's going into direct and everything right that is going to the power amp, or vice versa, which means you're limited to a mono output with mono effects. Again, if you only have a mono cab or you don't care, then good enough, I suppose. And that will allow you to run one of those outputs into front of house or recording and one to the power amp. Of course, if you have this set up in stereo like I do now, you're gonna have to change a few things. So there's a bridged output on this power amp that will allow more power, or you just run one channel. And of course, you're gonna change some setup on your cabinets, depending on if you're using a stereo cab like this or one that has mono input, all that good stuff. But it is doable, and the patch is basically identical minus those caveats. And because you're only using mono effects, you can actually bring back the CPU power a little bit and put in other blocks if you want. For me, not really necessary. We've shown countless times that a real guitar amp through a load box and an AX8 is one of the more powerful guitar rigs you can have. And of course, you pair that with a nice power amp and a stereo cabinet, and you're on your way to wet, dry, wet in the room heaven, if that's what you're after. So definitely a good showing by Matrix here. It's one of the best power amps I've ever played through, and certainly a must-have for those of us that still like all the convenience of digital while playing through real speaker cabinets. So I thought that was a bit more valuable than a 5-minute video of going, this is a good power amp, let me play through it, and that's it. So hopefully gives you a couple decent ways of how to use any type of stereo power amp. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, as always, leave them below. We will see you next time. Bye.